Oop. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Tim Wilson, and welcome to the latest CAS Virtual Showcase webinar. I'm your host today, and I'm delighted to welcome the brilliant folks from the CAS working group responsible for assessment in computing, more of which in a brief moment. So a little bit about me. I am one of a team of CAS community outreach managers operating throughout the country. I'm responsible for managing CAS communities of practice across the Midlands and a large part of the Southwest. And we do this as part of the National Centre for Computing Education. This webinar is the latest part of the CAS Virtual Showcase. We are now into day 9. Tomorrow is our last day, so a huge thank you to all of you for coming along to the webinars during these past 2 weeks. Now on to our presenters. A big welcome to John, Jane, Tig, Andrew, Richard, Simon and Julie, who have been very busy during the CAS Virtual Showcase with their CAS Assessment Working Group. In this webinar, the group will report back on their work and findings, but I'll leave it to them to talk further about what they've been up to. During the session, if you have questions, please use the question window on the right-hand side of your screen to ask questions. As many of you know who have been attending these sessions, all attendees are in listen-only mode. So the top of the window in your control panel has an orange rectangle which can be expanded or collapsed. If you expand it, you will find the questions tab. In the meantime, please tweet using the hashtag CASVirtual20, and I hope you enjoy the session. Over to John, who will kick things off. John, it's all yours.
Good afternoon, folk. I'm John Willard. I'm chair of the CAS Assessment Working Group. Who are we? It's a group of volunteers. We're all volunteers. We carry out activities which enable discussions to take place about assessment issues. Several working groups. Another one is the research working group, and you'll bump into Jane later on in the afternoon. She chairs that group. Who are we? Well, most of the meetings are attended by teachers. Many people are coming from the universities, the teacher training aspects, etc. People from industry and particularly the awarding organisations. What do? Well, we talk. We chat, we discuss the issues, but importantly, we then write it down and we pass that forward. SCAC is the Schools Curriculum and Assessment Committee that's run by BC in response to the last Royal Society report. We report directly to them, we report directly to CAS Board. So that's important because the people who are on those boards and on those committees are bumping into people who make decisions about what happens in classrooms. They talk to people at Ofqual, Ofsted, the DFE, SQA in Scotland, etc. So we have some form of influence. If we say something, it's a teacher's voice being passed forward. Okay, that's enough from me. This week we had 4 topics under review. 3 of them we had discussion sessions, and the first of those discussion sessions was with transition. Before that, though, Julie's going to talk about something that we did previously this year to do with inclusion. Over to you, Julie.
I think Julie might be having problems with her access. So what we might do is we might come back to Julie, and because we always like it to be on, on the edge. And we're going to start off with Andrew and Tig, but Andrew has also got some problems. So Tig, can you cover this?
Yeah, pretty much. So we talked about transition, and we looked at transition from an assessment perspective. But to give you a larger picture, if we're looking at this slide, the overall transition has been identified by sort of Ofsted and the learned bodies that a school-led transition is a good transition. A department-led transition improves on the school-led. So to get an outstanding transition, the whole school have to be involved, and then the department get involved beyond there. So from that perspective, we're looking at trying to put the icing on the cake, because obviously we can't change whole school. So as part of these conversations, one of the things we were discussing is that one of the keys to the transition is both the conversation with your feeders and the assessment. And from our perspective is this assessment. Do we just take the numbers coming from the primaries, or do we run some kind of baselining? And this will lead into what Richard's going to be talking about afterwards with the quantum. So in order to make a good transition, we have to have reasonable information about the pupils coming up. Ideally, we want a good relationship with that primary so we know what their curricula is looking like. We know what they're teaching, and we can modify ours to give continuity between those. And obviously, it's harder to modify secondary curricula on the basis that we've got 4 or 5 primaries. But if we're developing that relationship, the department-led end of this is about coordinating with our primaries, identifying where there are gaps, and either helping them to fill those gaps, or coming up with transition activities which can fill them, or modifying our own curricula so that we make sure we've covered those early on. Can we stick to the next click on, Jane? Brilliant. Thank you. So when we look at the overall side of things, you can see the meet the form teacher, the coordinator with feeders, that's all school led. Where we come in here are good activities. So on the transition days, things that work well and give the kids a wow, really, really improve our transition and improve engagement. Okay. We've got physical computing, we've got programming bits and bobs in here, we've got unplugged in here. These are all ideas for activities. However, activities don't just have to happen on your transition day. In an ideal world, if you're coordinating with your primary, once their SATs are over, we can use computing projects. So we can get a task our feeders can take part in, and that gives us a couple of advantages. If we interact with this task, if we work with this task and we work with our primaries, we can take the results of that task and we get something that we can use to then assess the students coming to us, that we absolutely know where they are because we've got the work they produced. So when we have that conversation, assessing them from their teachers is great, but we've got to have a good insight into where their teacher is. Is their judgment sound for computing, or are they a maths English specialist with no background? And we don't want to be insulting to our primaries, but actually if we've got some work they've marked, it's a really good starting point. And to an extent, that can offset the need for as much baselining as we start with. Can we go to the next one, Jane? Brilliant. COVID has changed things somewhat. Okay, so school-led transitions at the moment are very, very mixed bag. So we've got some schools that are actually doing a physical visit day for the year 6s, very rare at the moment. We've got a lot of people doing virtual meetings, so they're meeting form tutors, they're meeting departments, they're meeting areas. Where we can go in here is we can start coming up with these bespoke activities I've already mentioned. So we can come up with tasks that can be given to our feeder 6s that will allow them to come into our school, having experienced work at the kind of level.
Tig, you've disappeared for a few minutes. We've actually got Andrew here now. As Andrew, we can't hear Tig, Andrew, can you carry on?
Yes, I can carry on. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go for it, Andrew.
Right. It looks like I'm out of quarantine at the moment in North Wales. So apologies for being late. So as Tig was saying, bespoke activities with the primary schools. We've seen a lot of partner organisations signposting, repurposing content, which again, we can publicise. Some departments are doing virtual tours of computing departments. And finally, our discussions ended. Go
next
back,
slide.
Jane. Yeah, next slide, please. Our discussions ended. We're talking about developing a baseline assessment for year 6, which I think is our 10 minutes. Is our time up?
I think it might be.
Thank you.
Yeah, which is a nice segue into Richard.
Over to Richard.
Oh yeah, yep. So I'm reporting on quantum, and sadly the slide that you're showing, Jane, isn't the most up-to-date one. I don't know why that is. It doesn't matter. I simply put an extra sentence on this page to say that what quantum is. is a CAS project to crowdsource multiple choice questions in computing. And that's for anybody who doesn't know that. There we are, that's the one. It always happens if you try and update the slides at the last minute and the presentation mode's already on, it doesn't change them, of course. Thanks, Jane, thanks for switching back, because that matters for another slide as well. The project's been going on, I think, since around 2016, for about 4 years or so. And we had, in this last 2 weeks, 3 workshops to look at different aspects of the project. First of all, to try and actually understand what it is to do the quizzes in quantum. Sadly, nobody turned up for that meeting, but I managed to push that into the beginning of the second meeting, where we looked at the quality of the content, the question content, and also the explanations that are given by question authors and the explanations that can be given by students. When they answer the questions, they're not just asked to give A, B, C, and D, they're also asked to say why they think the answer is correct. And this is a really important issue from my point of view, because it changes multiple choice question answering into a learning experience, but more than simply a recall or performance. So moving on, we had a third session a couple of days ago where we spent our time saying, well, what's next? You know, we've had this project going for 4 years. What's changed and what's next? And I'm going to try and say something about that in my last slide, but if we can go to the next slide. This is just to give you an overview of the kinds of things we looked at. This is actually the answer to a question Simon Peyton-Jones asked 2 days ago. How many responses have been given? And the answer is about 4,331,000 or so. And that was earlier this year, so that will have gone up since then. So there is a substantial data set of answers that are in the quantum system. And although the chart isn't the easiest to understand, if I interpret the first bar and say that there are something like 1,500 questions for which there are between 100 and 200 responses. So that means that there's a vast number of questions there with a substantial number of answers, going up to some questions which have in the range of 3,500 to 4,000 responses, and that's pretty much the top end. Yeah. So what that means is that there is, when I say substantial data set, I mean in a research sense, we can discover things from that data because we have a good sample. Okay. Now, when I say we can you go to the next slide, Jane? It's entirely reasonable for any teacher who signs up into Diagnostic Questions to look at this data. And this is the example I showed in the second workshop of a question which has been answered badly by half the students. They're getting answer D when they should be getting answer B. And not only that, but they're not improving as they get older, at least not very much. You can also see that most children answered this question at age 12. And that's interesting because this is, I think, a question that comes from a baseline quiz in quantum. So in order to, in the sense of making that link with the previous presentation, quantum is well set up to, at least with multiple choice questions, make sense of what children's knowledge is. It may not be brilliant for other kinds of knowledge, of course. Moving on to the next slide, please, Jane. Not only can we readily find the quantities of answers at different ages, any teacher can, they can also go and find this kind of stuff, which is what the students said about the question. So
Richard, we can't hear you, Richard. Richard, try again. Tim, can you hear Richard, or is it just me?
I can't hear Richard either. I think they might be the same for everyone else.
That bing means an email just arrived. I think the same thing happened to Richard that happened to me.
That's a very powerful email. Okay. What would you like to do, Jane?
John, are you able to
I'll
carry on?
finish off Richard's presentation, Jane.
Good.
The important thing about the Quantum Project is that we've got a potential tool there, and the third session, the number of people who attended were talking about the future and how we can use the system, how it can be developed further. The power comes from the fact that it's readily accessible. There were some issues about usability came up, and I'm sure that they will be listened to by the ED Diagnostic Questions team. But the important thing is that we're finding data that will inform what is happening in schools, so that if these activities are taken by Year 6, they can then, the results are then usable by Key Stage 3.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, Richard, carry on.
I'm sorry. Shall I take up the cudgels again, John? I'm not entirely sure what you said, to be honest, but can we go on to the last slide? I think it's the last slide. This is just, these were the kinds of conclusions, John, that I drew from our meeting, and they're my conclusions. So I don't want to claim that I caught every single thing that people said, but you can see that one and two I've already talked about. What's important to understand is that this means that if we've got this data, it can inform teachers' content pedagogy. They can understand better how children respond to particular questions at particular ages, and even look into gender if they wish to. Okay, but it also means we can improve the quality of questions, because the data can tell us or inform a discussion around, is the question of good quality? So we can improve based on that data. But there are problems in moving teachers to adopt this. We discussed that at length in the meeting on Tuesday. And my belief is that that means that the things I've explained mean there's a pedagogical opportunity at the adult level for teachers, I mean, in CPD and initial teacher education. So my final points, two final points, and I think I've got to stop. One is that perhaps we need to put 3, 4, 5, and 6 together of those points. In other words, combine those opportunities. And the final thing, it's good that Julie's just suddenly appeared, because I'm hoping to work with Julie, and it makes a good link. I'm hoping to work with Julie on the a CAS in a Box resource. I don't know who knows what that means, but it essentially is a presentation resource for CAS Hub and CAS Community of Practice leaders to run workshops, but one that's based on the quantum opportunities that I've described above. And that was all I was going to say.
All right, thank you, Richard. So I'm going to take over now and talk about our the next working group, which was part of the assessment team. And we were looking at emergency remote teaching and what particularly were the issues in terms of formative assessment whilst we're teaching in lockdown. And we were looking at 4 questions. So there were, to what extent are we using formative assessment during lockdown? What are the challenges and barriers? How we're overcoming these, and how we can share these ideas to support others. And we had a number of different activities within our group. And the first one was on Tuesday the 23rd. We had a session on ABC. Now, what is ABC? It's a process for developing online teaching activities, which was developed by University College London, and which CAS Research, which John mentioned before, which I am the working group chair for, has been looking at and has adapted. So we've had a group of amazing teachers who've come together as part of the CAS Research working group and have adapted this university process to be used in schools. And we presented that. There was a big bunch of us, and we had a really good time if you attended. And we presented on that, and about 40 people took part. And they now know a little bit about ABC, but we know we need to do more. And so our next steps are, we're running an interactive 90-minute session today, but we're sold out, on ABC in schools, As Richard mentioned, we're also creating a CAS in a Box activity for CAS communities to learn about ABC, and we're also going to be running drop-in sessions. We found those to be really important in terms of helping teachers to develop ABC in their own schools. And we're not sure whether we can completely move that to the communities yet, because there needs to be a degree of expertise to support them to begin with. So it's all about sharing expertise. If you want to find out more, if you go to the CAS website and you just type in ABC in the search bar, you'll find our stuff. So Julie is here, and we've only just managed to get her online, and she's going to have a go. I think you're muted at the moment, Julie.
No, I'm muted, I
She's
think.
going to talk about a second activity we did, which was to do some online polls. So off you go.
Yes, I apologise for my being late. So as Jane said, there was an informal survey which took place using Facebook, 3 particular groups. Now, looking at the presentation you have in front of you, if I just explain very, very briefly that there is one graph there which relates to primary teachers, and then there are 2 which relate to secondary teachers. Now, I'm going to speak very briefly about them because I do understand that this is going to be published on the CAS website at some time. So if you'd like to come back and interrogate the details yourself, it's there for you to do so. However, if I just mention that the blue surrounded graph there, it relates to the responses of primary computing coordinators, and as you can see, it's predominantly little or no formative assessment compared with usual practice. And that is really important, because the question was, to what extent are you formatively assessing learning during lockdown compared with usual practice? So that's very important. So predominantly little or no assessment, formative assessment is taking place. Let's go on to the secondary now. There are 2 graphs here because there were 2 populations who were asked for their responses. The one on the left is the results of the survey of secondary ICT and computing teachers. And as you can see there, vast majority answered that yes, the formative assessment is there, but it's patchy. But then you have some teachers responding at either extreme, at the extremes of this particular scale. The final graph here is a survey of CAS members, secondary CAS members. And as you can see here, predominantly we see that most teachers are at either extreme in their responses. So hardly any patchy, and then at the other end, a lot in the same. I would draw your attention to the poll data. I've done a few little calculations. We had a 4% uptake or responses from the population, 4% of primary coordinators, less than 1% of ICT and computing teachers, and there's almost 8% of CAS members. Now, when we interrogated this, there were 3 things that really were a concern to us, and matters arising from our scrutiny of the data here. We were considering whether the results might be as they are, in particular related to Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2, in that it has something to do with formative assessment at this particular stage of development, and that its primary practice might, in the context of the question asked, which might have shown this detail here, because lots of primary practice, the formative assessment would happen actually there and then, although it does happen in secondary as well. Other concerns, we were just wondering whether the data might have appeared in this way because of the nature of teaching and learning during the lockdown. This is a totally new experience, which leads on to our 3rd consideration of this, which was assessment Is it taking place? It probably is taking place, but it's not taking place in a formal way. And so we're assuming, well, not assuming, we thought that it might be actually based on the lack of recorded assessment, formative assessment. And so stage of development, the newness of the environment we find ourselves in, and also the method of recording, those might be areas that would explain this. And finally, I just to say that this is just an indication, but if we need to go into further detail, I'm sure that would need some further research. But thank you.
Thanks very much, Julie. So moving on, so we did those, they were just Facebook polls, so they weren't big deal surveys, they were just quick polls that we did on a number of different Facebook groups. But I'm now going to talk about a third activity that we did, which kind of adds to our understanding, and that's we had an online meeting. About a dozen people took part on Monday the 29th. It was very interactive. We worked in primary, secondary and breakout rooms, and I think some of the people who took part are actually online now, and I want to say a massive thank you because I think you're all there. We did this thing where we used virtual post-it notes and stickies, or using it in Google Slides. We brainstormed our ideas and experiences on our questions. We were going to have Nick Hughes presenting, but unfortunately he had to be teaching in school, so I'm going to be Nick. Not quite the same, but I'm going to have a go. I've grouped the sticky notes, some of the sticky notes, not all of them, into different sections. And so the purple ones, they were all the quiz ones, so you'd be pleased to see those, Richard. So teachers are using Quantum. We then had two other groups of responses, which were around, the yellow ones in the middle are where teachers are doing asynchronous teaching. So the learning is happening not at the same time as the teacher and the pupil being online at the same time. And teachers were making the learning visible through things like Showbie, Purple, MASH, J2E, Seesaw. But then there was this question about when was the feedback happening? And in some of those tools, the feedback can be within the system, and in some of those tools, it's not. So there's something there for us to think about. And then the green set of sticky notes, that was where the learning was made visible through synchronous activities, so where both the teachers and the pupils are online at the same time, and there's also feedback at the same time. We've got similar set of kind of responses or ideas come through from the secondary group, but I don't have time to go into that. What I am going to show you is the kind of sticky notes or ideas that we had around barriers to formative assessment. And I've stolen Simon's analysis approach. So Simon, thank you. So what Simon did was he grouped them by the different kind of people who are involved, so the pupils, school, teachers and parents. And again, this is not all of our sticky notes, it's just the ones that we really thought were most important. And we had like little stickers, like what were the top things and what were the bottom or middle things. So for pupils, it was just simply that they don't have access to kit to enable them to either be taught, so or for their learning to be made visible, or for us to give feedback. So all three bits. And it was also difficult for teachers to see how well the children were doing and how much support was given. But our top issue was around the huge range of different kit and systems that are being used by teachers, classes and schools, and there wasn't a consistent thing that pupils were kind of receiving. And also the issue for schools who are trying to introduce wholesale change of software and hardware in order to deal with emergency remote teaching. For teachers, it was just the fact that there needs to be loads of training, and we did consider the fact that many of the people who were in the working group, they're specialists, and so they were able to support their schools in a way that most of the schools wouldn't have that benefit. And then for parents, it was that they're not engaging, and all the issues of how on earth we support them in this situation. And there was a general kind of the big red long sticky note at the bottom was this issue of what does safeguarding mean? Does it mean we can't, or we can do face-to-face teaching? So I'm now going to pass on to Simon, who's going to look at barriers for secondary. So Simon, off you go.
Hello, yeah, so I'm a secondary school teacher. I'm a head of department at Puttridge High School and fortunate enough to take part in this. And I think with what we looked at, we came up with these same categories. So pupil, teacher and parent seem to be the three top barriers that we came up with. And I think by contrast to primary, actually we put that pupils don't have access to kit as being a mid or a mild issue. It wasn't quite as large as it was for primary, but a far greater one for us was that pupils were not engaging and haven't been engaging in their work, which has been a very big pupil focus. Within the teacher side of it, we thought about the fact that a lot of teachers are struggling with the support and training to be able to use all the different systems that we've got. There are lots of schools that are struggling with being able to get onto the Google platform or the Microsoft platform, and actually being confident that all of the members of staff are able to actually comfortably use all of those systems effectively. Another issue that we found for teachers as being a top issue is that there's such a variety of progression levels, particularly with some schools going for the asynchronous or the synchronous route, and the fact that it's very difficult to differentiate a lot of the resources that teachers are giving. So therefore it's often quite hard to try and understand where pupils are having misconceptions. And then I suppose in the final category, in the parent category, we have we identified that one of the big issues was that a lot of parents haven't been engaging with their child's support and looking at the various platforms, or also not being able to understand how to use the different platforms as well. You know, similarly to the primary, we have at the bottom here as a low issue is around the safeguarding aspects of face-to-face teaching. So we identified that, and as a kind of mid section for the teachers, we said that feedback can take quite a long time, particularly if it isn't auto-marked, or if teachers are not using programs like the Diagnostic Questions, and it's very difficult to try and keep up with the levels of marking if you're used to something that is book-based. So that kind of summarised a lot of our issues or barriers within secondary.
Cool, thank you so much, Simon. So Julie, is that all right? You're going to summarise the things that we're going to do? Right, yes. Off you go.
I'm sorry, I'm on my third digital device. Right, let's have a look. Yes, so we're in the process of analysing the work from the working group, and the intention is to create the following to share our ideas and to support others, and you see them in front of you. So first one, top tips on what works. 3, what is working and what doesn't work, and then that's going to be published on the CAS website. The second one is a write-up. This is an approach and outcomes, and this will be done as a CAS assessment working group document, and that's to share with others. We're going to write up a fuller, more academic paper on what we found as a CAS research working group, and this again is for sharing. Lastly, a write-up in the Hello World, which is if you haven't come across it already, is an absolutely fantastic magazine created for computer science educators and computing educators, and this is going to be based on the ideas we've gathered.
So I think that's us kind of finished. So I'd just like to say we had nearly 200 teachers who took part in our polls. We had over 40 teachers attending ABC, and we've had a dozen teachers who are like the core now, who are working on writing everything up. And I just wanted to say a massive thank you, because this is an amazing community of teachers who are contributing to this kind of body of knowledge. So I just want to say thank you. And then it's on to John to finish.
Julie, do you want to go through your inclusion stuff on slide 3?
If there's time, and if you would like me to do it, I will be very pleased to do it.
There you go.
Right, thank you. So during the process of creating this list of inclusive assessment practices in assessing computing, we were really interested in having an underpinning set of criteria. Now, basically, there were 4 main, although there were other considerations, but these are the main ones. We wanted to reflect the professional experience, not only of those around the table, but also of our colleagues. And we also wanted to base it or have it reflect rigorous academic research findings. Secondly, we wanted to include all pupils and students in this. So we're thinking about every person within this learning community. We wanted it to be collaborative, not only in its composition, but its editing. So it's been winging its way across the ether. And we were thinking about the composition of it. We thought approximately 10. It depends on what we find. So approximately 10 in total. So after extensive discussion, we scrutinized a plethora of papers. We had a whole wealth of information that needed to be distilled and then fashioned into 10, but it became 9 succinct statements. So as we were going through this, it became clear that we were not only considering the assessment of computing or inclusive assessment of computing, but also the planning, because they're somewhat inseparable. The information that we gathered, we distilled, as I said, into 9 statements. And this was the result of many hours of discussion, research. And we thought that not only should we have those statements, but in some shape or form, the information which we've gathered should be available to our colleagues as well. So consequently, the Assessment Working Group has produced 2 complementary documents, and the one you see here, the statements from the Inclusive Practice in Assessment. There is a sibling on planning, and you'll find those on the CAS website. So we're now in the process of exploring how best to present for our colleagues the comprehensive information which underpins those 9 statements you see there. So these resources represent a combination of professional experience, academic research, and what we were very keen on achieving, especially as we came through the process and we were deciding upon the wording of those key statements. We looked in particular at the vocabulary, and out of the conversation, we just identified that this not only provides suggestions on practice, suggestions on the practice, but it also gives us a vocabulary, a common vocabulary, which we can use in our discourse. And that's where we are so far. And I'll just say that we are in the process of thinking how best, as I said, to present the rest of the information we have. And so I wonder, John, if there are any suggestions from others. We'd be very, very pleased to hear. How would you like it presented? And thank you very much for listening. And I'm so sorry I was late.
Thank you very much, Julie. Okay, just a couple of minutes to sum up. All of the resources that have been used during the past 2 weeks, that are the things to stimulate the discussions, the discussion records, etc., and any reporting of our findings will be available on the CAS community website under the resources section. If you can grab these slides, then of course you'll be able to click on the links that are on the last page there, and it'll take you directly to the resources. Interestingly, as people have been talking, we've got 4 themes here: transition, quantum, emergency remote teaching, and inclusion. And whatever way you look at it, you can see the connections between them It's a very powerful group of things. We're talking about assessing pupils' attainment, but we're talking about assessment for their learning, assessment for teaching. We're also talking about the way in which we might have to give a number to a child. In other words, we've got to communicate to another professional, this is where they are in the system. But all of this is coming together right now. The issues of transition with emergency remote teaching and how information is going to get between the schools, etc. And of course, quantum being one of the solutions. It's got its challenges, but it is a really big solution for all of this. So, do we have any questions?
I'm just checking through now. We don't have any questions. I think there was one question that asked what ERT stood for, so that actually might be good to be put to the attendees as well, what it stands for.
So ERT stands for Emergency Remote Teaching, and it's a term that was coined at the beginning of the pandemic, and it's to try and distinguish between this sudden pivot to some kind of teaching as opposed to online teaching, because online teaching takes time, months to design. So it's a way to clearly say that what we're doing now is not standard online or distance learning, it's emergency remote teaching.
I think that there's a really important point there, because the secondary schools are used to e-learning or their use of VLEs, etc. But this is different, and even in the secondary schools where they've had that sort of equipment, those sorts of resources, this is still emergency remote teaching for many members of staff who never properly engaged with the VLEs up until this point in time. So that's really important.
And the work that was done, so the original term that was coined by a group of academics, they said really clearly, we should not beat ourselves up about this if we're not quite doing the same that we would if we'd planned it over months. That it's something where it's best endeavours, and it's something that we need to look at differently. So I hope that answers the question.
And perhaps we should have a message about CPD for teachers, that this situation might arise again in the not too distant future, and perhaps we do need to upskill in this area, so that again, quantum is going to be one of the answers to the challenges we're going to have in the future, as a means to be able to quickly and effectively find out what the pupils are doing at home when we can't physically see them.
Absolutely. Two more points. Can we get the PowerPoint, please? Is it okay if we distribute the PowerPoint?
Yes, of course. Tim, you've got the link to it. If you can distribute it. I think we're happy that it's the final version right now.
Great.
Right, the most important message is that the assessment working group goes on. This has just been a phase. We are going to be discussing other issues. We'll discuss these issues again. If you want to join those discussions, email assessment.wg@computingatschool.org.uk, and you'll be getting into the email links and get connected with those people who are having these sorts of discussions and writing reports, which then get passed forward to committees and other organisations, which then get, hopefully, messages get clearly put through to the likes of the DFE and Ofqual, etc. Thank you very much for your attention this afternoon. Thank you all of you, Jane, Simon, Richard, Tim and Tig and Andrew, who are not on the screen. Thanks very much.
Cool. I just want to say at the end of this session, when I close it down, a survey will pop up in your browser. So please take a moment to feedback, and also if you have any comments. And please also share any additional comments on Twitter using the hashtag CAS Virtual 20. This is our last session today. Our next session will be tomorrow at 10. It'll be our last day. Our first speaker will be Barry Lambert, and he will be introducing Tinkercad. So all things around making use of code blocks. So I just want to say thank you as well to John and everyone here today for the fantastic work that they've been doing and continue to do. So I really appreciate it. And I just say thank you to all the attendees as well for coming. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Tim.
Bye.